The central idea of this book is to explain what Keynes did and the damage that Keynes has caused with his book.
Contar qué fue lo que hizo Keynes y el daño que ha causado Keynes con este libro.
And what it implies in terms of economic thought.
En materia del pensamiento económico.
In fact, Hazlitt said that everything that was new in Keynes' book General Theory was bad, and everything that was good was actually stolen, thus it was not a very interesting book from the academic point of view. But it was from the point of view of politics, because basically the general theory is a pamphlet.
Porque básicamente la teoría general es un panfleto
dedicated to corrupt and messianic thieves and politicians, and that is why every time they find a politician of the worst kind, he will always have a Keynesian giving him an endorsement, that is, he created the basis to justify the theft. So that is why where Keynesianism is applied ends up generating problems.
Es por eso que donde se aplica el keynesianismo termina generando problemas.
So, without a doubt, the most emblematic example of systematic application of Keynesianism is Argentina. Argentina ended the 19th century being the country with the highest per capita GDP in the world, as a consequence of having adhered to the ideas of Juan Bautista Alberdi. We enter the first half of the 20th century, oscillating between position 5 and position 8 in per capita GDP. And after 70 years of systematic application of the delirious Keynesian ideas, complemented with the monetary delirium of the Argentine structuralists and Julio Hipólito Guillermo Oliver La Cabeza, that caused so much damage that today the country is in the ranking, as it is measured, between 55 and 60, and that in case of a crisis, we will surely fall to level 80. Therefore, it is interesting to be clear about the damage that Keynesianism has caused. At least to keep it in mind, and that it ends up generating problems that the remedy is worse than the disease. The book basically is 4 parts, and that is how I'm going to try to explain it. It has a first part that explains how the analytical framework worked prior to the general theory. And that is very important because, from my point of view, the general theory is not badly written. It is fantastically written. The problem is Keynes' ideas. And not only is it tremendously written, but also the book is genius. It just so happens that it is a genius of evil, that is, it is a genius put in favor of the criminals. But is this still a genius? So, once one understands how the framework prior to Keynes worked, we can understand what Keynes does. And that also allows him to notice Friedman's work. Because basically Friedman's work, the academic work, is a mirror of Keynes' work. What Friedman does is take apart each of the points that Keynes raised, and that allows him to reconstruct pre-Keynes thought in terms of micro-fundamentals and intertemporal terms, which is raised by Lucas, and in the 4th part of the presentation, we are going to see the whole discussion in terms of economic growth theory, which in the end will show that the Austrians won the debate, that the way in which the Austrians were left arguing was out of the mainstream. So they won the debate and did not find out. And the reality is that if the Austrians incorporate these elements that make up the modern theory of economic growth, They would have a lot to give and to leave a very strong mark on the academy.
una marca muy fuerte en la academia. Esa es la
That is the feeling I have. But beyond that, I think there is a valuable discussion,
hay una discusión valiosa y que
and that if the Austrians took certain tools which the neoclassics communicate,
austríacos tomaran ciertas herramientas con las cuales se comunican los neoclásicos,
they would have a historic victory on the academic level.
entonces me parece
So I think it is a challenge that is worth doing. Well, what you find here is the geological tree of macroeconomics. This graph is not mine.
gráfico no
It is a graph that is in an article called The Bixels Connection,
en un artículo que se llama The Bixel
or The Bixels Connection by Axel Hohenhoff.
de Honhofood. No
It is still interesting how it raises the macroeconomic debate. And what one has to understand is the logic of the savings investment schemes for Bixels.
es la lógica de los esquemas ahorro-inversión a la Bixel.
Basically, Bixels worked with an idea of the goods market and the money market.
Con una idea de del mercado de bienes y el mercado de dinero.
The goods market was given by the interaction of savings and investment.
Sí, venía dado por la interacción del ahorro y la inversión.
And understanding well what is behind savings and investment is key.
Detrás del ahorro y la inversión es clave
To understand everything that came later. Basically, the system is a Walrasian system,
es un sistema de índole balraciana,
a system of general equilibrium where the relative equilibrium prices are determined,
precios relativos de equilibrio.
and the interest rate is neither more nor less than the relative price of the present goods
Precio relativo de los bienes presentes
compared to the future goods. From there, one finds when the interest rate falls artificially,
que básicamente cuando sube la tasa de interés, que
which means that the prices of the present goods are above the future goods.
están por encima de los bienes,
If the present consumption is made more expensive,
el consumo presente se hizo más caro
then you substitute the present consumption for future consumption.
futuro. De ahí,
From there, the savings increases when the interest rate rises.
o sea, no es ni más
It is neither more nor less than saying that the present consumption is expensive,
sustituyo hacia
so I substitute it towards the future consumption.
y eso digamos
It is a matter of substitution, and you see this in a traditional microcourse with total clarity. And on the other hand, the issue of production,
producción
which is linked to investment.
con la inversión.
When the interest rate drops, one says that the investment increases.
Okay, digamos, ¿qué significa?
What does it mean that the investment increases because the interest rate dropped?
Básicamente,
Basically, it is because the future prices are higher than the present goods.
sí, entonces en ese contexto
So in that context, it is convenient for you to shift production from the present to the future,
de ahí
and that is a good investment. From there, the relationship between investment and interest rate is negative. But what is important to note is that the system is based on what is called a general equilibrium system,
sistema de equilibrio general
and that the distinction between present goods and future goods,
de bienes presentes y
that relative price will throw the interest rate at you. In fact, the whole system will be in equilibrium
todo el sistema va a estar en equilibrio
when the relative price of all goods is in the same line of the interest rate.
en la misma línea de tasa de interés,
Then you will have,
porque si no
because otherwise you would have arbitrages between goods. And in the meantime, you would have arbitrages between goods. And on the other hand, if you look,
Bixel también
Bixel also derives from the quantitative theory.
relativa, es decir, en el
That is, in the money market, the purchasing power of money was determined.
adquisitivo del dinero. Ahora,
Now that had a problem.
tenía un problema.
In monetary theory, that is called the problem of invalid dichotomy.
La dicotomía inválida. Básicamente,
In monetary theory, invalid dichotomy has to do with an inconsistency between the functions of excess demand in the goods market and what is the function of excess demand in the money market. Specifically, the functions of excess demand in the goods market.
exceso de demanda en el mercado de bienes
If you go to a traditional text of microeconomics,
de microeconomía,
are what are called zero-degree homogeneous.
grado cero. Es decir,
And if you double all the relative prices,
los precios relativos
they remain constant. Consequently, there would be no modification on those functions.
sobre esas funciones.
However, the quantitative theory is 1-degree homogeneous.
Si ustedes duplicaran
If you double the prices, the demand for money is doubled,
la demanda de dinero se duplica.
and you would have an excess demand.
Exceso de demanda. Entonces vean
Then see how interesting. Although the framework in the concept was correctly proposed and the analysis made sense, it had a problem of mathematical inconsistency, because now you assume that all the prices are doubled. In other words, apart from a situation of equilibrium, all the prices are doubled. If you were in the goods market in equilibrium, nothing has changed, and consequently, the N-1 markets that make the goods are in equilibrium. Therefore, by Walras's law, he knew that the remaining market would have to be in equilibrium. However, since the quantitative theory is 1 degree homogeneous, you have an excess demand in the money market. Therefore, you have a problem of 1 degree inconsistency. That is what the theory called the invalid dichotomy. And that dichotomy was resolved by Ludwig von Mises in the theory of money and credit, when he incorporated money into the function of utility, with the idea of marginal utility of increasing. So, now money enters into the arbitration relations of individuals, and that has some very interesting consequences. The first is that money ceases to be neutral, because when you enter money, even when everyone receives the same amount of monetary units, everyone has different preferences, with which they will evaluate it in a different way. Therefore, they will be modifying the savings and investment relations. Therefore, they will be altering the capital structure. That is, they will be making a mess when they pull money from outside the system. And I don't need to tell you if, in addition, money does not enter in an equal way to everything, but also enters through a channel. You start to see what is called the Cantillon effect. The Cantillon effect, that is, a redistribution of income is produced, and it still does much more damage. Obviously, Mises's book also had his hypothesis of the cycle, and what the crisis of 1929 to 1933 predicted. And that is why the dominant school at that time was the Austrian school. That is, the dominant school prior to the Great Depression was the Austrian school, because Mises's work was truly formidable. And where Mises was most interested in was his question of inflation, and that if they were manipulating the interest rate, the central banks were going to generate some kind of problem. In fact, if you look, the Swedes were also concerned about the issue of inflation, but they thought in terms of what is called the theory of loans, where the banks, in competition, trying to move their competitors, artificially lowered the interest rate, and that later generated inflation. However, this scheme is not very attractive, basically, because you cannot be permanently modifying what is called the monetary multiplier. And on the other hand, in the case of Cambridge, England, and in fact Keynes himself is there, it was the issue of deflation, and hence the idea that investors sold bonds, which that made the price of the bonds low. Therefore, the interest rate was high, and that generated an excess supply of goods, which counteracted an excess demand and made the system go into deflation. And in fact, Keynes is a much more interesting case than that of the general theory, because even when you had flexibility of prices in the labor market, that excess supply in the goods market results in a fall in the demand for work. And if, as a theoretical case, this does not mean that indeed someone will observe it in reality. What happened is that the demand for work could fall so much that they would cross with the supply if this were fixed at a negative salary level. But of course, the problem that Keynes wanted to explain at that time was the problem of what has to do with deflation and unemployment. In fact, the debate between Hayek and Keynes turns on this, because in the background what Keynes said is, look, the bond market is raising the interest rate very high, so what you have to do is lower the savings. That is, stimulate consumption for what? So that the savings is withdrawn until it reaches the level of interest rate that the bond market is giving me. And well, once that was reached and the bond market was normalized, then it could run. The problem is, as Hayek said, the problem is that when you do that, you are going to be altering the investment decisions. And you are going to be investing more intensively in consumer goods. So you are going to be altering the productive structure. And then when the situation changes, you are going to have to do something else, because now that structure does not work and you are going to be destroying market information. So it was like a kind of trap that always left us with the intervention by the public sector. And in fact, more intervention demands more intervention. And that was the debate. And in fact, in that debate, Hayek crushed Keynes. And at one point Keynes said, I don't know what I'm doing discussing this if I'm not interested anymore. Keynes launched into with the theme of his general theory. But what I'm interested in is to make it very clear how the model worked prior to general theory. That is, to understand that present and future consumption were part of the model and that saving is the future consumption. That investment is basically the translation of production over time. And that the interest rate is an intertemporal mechanism of coordination. And that the interest rates are ultimately the relative price of the present goods compared to the future goods. What do I mean by this? That even in an economy without money, there's an interest rate. Because the interest rate is inherent to the existence of time. This is a key point. To determine and be clear that in the goods market, the interest rate is determined, and that it is a relative price of present goods compared to future goods, and that is what gives the model intertemporal. And on the other hand, in the monetary market, what he determined is the purchasing power of money. From there, let's say that one understands the phrase of Friedman when he says, inflation is always and everywhere monetary phenomenon. When you emit money above demand, the purchasing power of money falls. Consequently, you need more monetary units to buy the same goods. And obviously, then we have determined the interest rate in the goods market, determination of the purchasing power of money in the money market. That is what needs to be understood. So where I have an interest rate above the level of equilibrium, or what is also called a natural rate or a Vixel rate, I am going to have an excessive supply of goods. I am going to have an excessive demand for money, and therefore a tendency for prices to fall. When the interest rate is below the natural level, there is going to be an excessive supply of goods, and an excess supply of money, and prices go up. That is how the previous analytical framework worked. And in this analytical framework, saving was an extremely important element, because it was the basis on which the economy grew, because saving was what financed investment, and the investment allowed accumulation of capital, and the increase in the capital stock per capita raised the real wages. Then there is a whole problem of the discussion of the format of the production function, whether they are growing performance, and all those kind of questions, or whether marginal performance is growing. And that discussion, this, starts to raise many problems in mathematics. Then the invalid dichotomy and the debate between Keynes and Hayek, I already mentioned them. What I want to show is the amount of aberrations that Keynes makes in his book. I mean, the first thing is that Keynes was not a liberal. Keynes was a person who supported fascism. He supported Hitler, he supported Mussolini. He traveled to Russia, to the Soviet Union. And when he returned in 1925, he writes 3 essays. In one of them, which is about the Soviet Union, he says that the system they implemented is the ideal. The only problem he saw with that system is that it had been applied with the violence of the Jews, with which the others were anti-Semitic. Clearly, he was a supporter of these totalitarian systems. Look at this phrase, which is in the prologue and the preface of the edition in German. He says, however, the theory of the product, in its entirety, which this book would try to offer, is by far more easily adaptable to the conditions of a totalitarian state than the theory of the production and distribution of the product given under the conditions of free competition and in good measure of laissez-faire. That is, it is a book written in favor of the totalitarians. That is why, in my different conferences, you see that I do not go with my book. I go with this nefarious book. Because when someone tells me, no, Keynes did not say that, I invite them to open the book and to tell me that he did not say. Look, then, this topic, which is very interesting, the part where he defines his general theory. He says, I will maintain that the postulates of classical theory are only applicable to a special case and not in general, because the conditions that they suppose are an extreme case of all positions possible of equilibrium. That is, he considers that his theory is general. And that the knowledge that there was, until that moment, was a particular case within his theory. And the reality, and this he will have seen in a book called Money and Time by Roger Garrison, that he separates what the macroeconomy of capital and the macroeconomy of work. Basically, what he calls the macroeconomy of work is what is the macroeconomy of the short term, and the macroeconomy of capital is the macroeconomy of the intertemporal. Hardly a single case. It is general, something that contains many periods. That is, we are already facing a lie, and we are already facing a lie. That is, it starts by lying. It starts by lying, it starts by saying a barbarity. That is, it cannot be that. A smaller set in the generality of a larger set. It starts directly with a lie. So now we're going to see the different parts of the destruction that Keynes does. Because, again, look, there is a phrase by Churchill that is brilliant and that Keynes paints just as it was. Churchill said that every time he met 2 economists, he went with 2 opinions, except when Keynes was there. Then he went with 3, because Keynes said, it can be like this or it can be in another way. Keynes did that regularly, and the general theory is written in that sense. In fact, when Hazlitt says, everything that is good is stolen, it is because the first chapter on the subject tells everything that was thought at that time. Let me give you an example. The first chapter of the investment is formidable. This is something that should be taught in all financial courses, because it is brilliant. Now, the next chapter is a monstrosity. Everything that is new is bad. So everything that is good is stolen. Everything that is new is bad. So let's go over the new things. Look at this. This is about consumption and interest rate. However, it is not likely that the usual short-term fluctuations in the interest rate have a lot of direct influence on the expenses in one way or another. There are not many people who alter their way of living because the interest rate drops from 5% to 4%. If their global income is the same as before, but indirectly other effects can be presented, although not all in the same direction. If you follow international newspapers, Argentina is back in the financial times. It is back in the economies with a relevant place. It was in the San Pablo Foci, and everything because of the disaster that took place in the last 2 weeks. Interesting, because the truth is that when the rate in the United States changed a very little, but it reached 3%, and in Argentina it caused a lot of problems. But what I want to show here is where it begins to be obvious that Keynes did not know about economics. Keynes had only taken an economics course with Marshall of 6 months, and we could call Marshall something like the champion of partial equilibrium. When you take a micro course and go to the part of consumer theory, it is very interesting, because when you deduce those functions of demand, it depends on the prices, but it also depends on the income. Why? Because it is a system of partial equilibrium. When you do general equilibrium, in reality, the income you derive is due to the sale of leisure in the work format multiplied by the salary, plus the participation you have in the companies. So if you look at the benefits, then the functions of excess demand only enter into the prices. It makes no sense for the definition of income to enter. Why? Because it is contained in its tendencies of company shares. So the price of the good of those companies and the prices of the factors it contracts. And also, it enters the price of the factor you're selling. Consequently, in general equilibrium, which is the same field of application of macroeconomics, but with micro foundations, in those functions only prices enter. The income does not enter. As Keynes had only taken a course with Marshall, he designs a function that depends for the moment on the prices and income. And as he says that the consumption is not affected by the interest rate, he makes that relative price phi and leaves a function of consumption in function of income. And why is this important? Because from that monstrosity appears the Keynesian multiplier. The Keynesian multiplier is a kind of miracle of the multiplication of bread. In fact, notice that it says, we leave sitting in chapter 8, that the occupation can only increase the equal footing with the investment. Now we can take this idea a little further, because in given circumstances, a defined relationship can be established that we will call multiplier between the income and the expenses of investment, and subject to certain simplifications between the total occupation and the occupation directly dedicated to investment. This new step is an integral part of our occupation theory, since given the propensity to consume, establishes a precise relationship between the occupation and the added income and the investment rate. What do we have here? Here, let's suppose the following. The income equals the demand, and the demand composed of 80 consumption and 20 investment. If that relationship, as the Keynesian says, was stable, one could say that the consumption is 80% of the income. So if you look, you can make a mathematical analysis that allows you to get that the investment is 5 times. Let's say multiplied by 5 gives you the income. And this is tremendous. Why is it tremendous? Because it is not going to be missing the oversight that says, well, let's make a public expense, and let's take the public expense from 20 to 40. So if the multiplier is 5, now the income is going to be 200, and the consumption is going to be 160, which seems wonderful if it weren't for the stupidity of the size of a house. Why? Because when you want the inflation to be 20, as the economy produces from 20 to 40, as the economy produces 100, the consumption is going to be reduced to 60. And if you also finance that with monetary emission, you're going to generate an inflation gap. You're going to redistribute the income. You are going to generate forced savings. For what? To sustain that level of investment, which is also assigned to any side. This is monstrous. Nothing good can come out of that. But imagine yourself telling this story, and when a Keynesian comes and says, you hate people, you want to lower the consumption to people, when in reality I am proposing that it becomes 160. Of course, they have no chance of winning the discussion. It's you or comparing the real worlds against the world of the pink, lunar, green elephants that float at 50,000 meters high. Of course, there is no way. But that conceptual error of Keynes, of confusing the general equilibrium with the partial equilibrium, taking a function of partial equilibrium, extrapolating it to the general equilibrium, derives from the Keynesian multiplier, which is neither more nor less than a violation of the physical restriction. In other words, in the background, the budget restriction is biased. That is why it generates a miracle. From there, let's say, that phrase that I use sometimes, when a politician has a problem and wants a Keynesian economist and a libertarian, then the politician asks them for a diagnosis. Both of them give the SME diagnosis, and then he asks, well, what do I do? Because they are men of action. But Keynesian says, with public spending, have in your hands the miracle of the multiplication of bread. Damn the chalkboard producers, who make them so small that they give the magic of public spending. And what does the libertarian say? The problem is yours, fix it. And who is he going to hire? The Keynesian. That's why they go around everywhere. Because they're just saying what politicians want to hear. But it is neither more nor less than a lie. The multiplier is a lie that starts from the extrapolation of an exercise of partial equilibrium to a situation of general equilibrium, with which it is a disaster and violates the restructuring of the budget. That is to say, in the end they are selling you smoke. But as if all this were not enough, under their logic, waste is great. If what you have to do is spend here, then look, and he says it explicitly. He says, if this is accepted, the previous reasoning shows how the ruinous spending on loans are, however, they enrich the community in the end. The construction of pyramids, earthquakes, and even wars can serve to increase wealth. That is, who comes up with that a war generates wealth? Who comes up with that? An earthquake can generate wealth. If war generates wealth, we live in war. Just thinking for 2 minutes, one realizes that this is a BS. In other words, it is a sick mind. Sick for stealing. Sick for stealing. Because Keynes was part of the political corruption. Now we come to the issue of saving, investment, and individual decision. That is, we have just destroyed the intertemporality on the road to consumption. Now there is no present consumption, future consumption. What is that nonsense of thinking in the long term? If in the long term for Keynes we are all dead. So now we have a function of consumption of a single period. In reality, it is a residue. So what does it say in terms of saving? Investment and individual decision? Because now we have already destroyed the function of saving. Now we are going for investment, it says. The only radical cure for the crisis of trust that affects the economic life of the modern world would be not to allow the individual to choose between consuming his income and ordering the production of capital assets, that even when they are based on precarious evidence, they impress it as the most sluggish investment that is within their reach. As Keynes does not want people to choose what to consume and what to save, and depending on how he saves, order the production. Like a totalitarian. And it continues. In fact, look at this. The consequences of the theory exposed are moderately conservative in other aspects. Well, it indicates the vital importance of establishing certain central controls in matters that are currently almost completely left in the hands of the private initiative. There are many fields of activity that it does not affect. The state will have to exert an orientating influence on the proposal to consume through a tax system, setting the interest rate and perhaps by other means. I force. It wants to set the interest rate. It wants to redistribute the income, to modify the margin of consumption. The guy wants to put his hand inside the system. That is why it is quite strange that there are people who say that this is liberal. But it continues. On the other hand, it seems unlikely that the influence of the banking policy on the interest rate is sufficient in itself to determine another optimal investment. Therefore, I believe that a fairly complete socialization of investments will be the only means of approaching full occupation. I do not know if you heard it, but I repeat it. A fairly complete socialization of investments will be the only means of approaching full occupation, although this does not need to exclude in any way the transaction or means by which the public authority cooperates with the private initiative. This is very interesting because look at how it begins to show a fascist trait in the transition to the socialist system, right? But apart from this, it is not advocated for a system of state socialism that covers most of the economic life of the community. It is not the property of the means of production that the state should assume, and this is capable of determining the global amount of resources intended to increase those means and the basic rate of remuneration of those who own them. It will have done everything that corresponds. That is pure fascism. Tell them what they have to produce, how they have to produce it, what prices to charge and how much to earn. Then I say, what role does the businessman have? I say, what is the property? It does not have any property. The property is a mirage. If it is not making any decision, then you have the basis of fascism. And it continues and says, in addition, the indispensable measures of socialization can be introduced gradually without the need to break with the general traditions of society. That is to get to socialism little by little. In fact, let's say in some talks, I have spoken about if you want to cook a frog, that is, if you want to cook a frog, do not throw the frog in hot water, because it jumps out. So what do? You put it in cold water and you put it to heat. Slowly. The frog will not recognize the problem until it's too late. That's how easy it is. This is what Keynes says to do. I did not say it is in the text. The text implies the basis to go to a communist system. What has Keynes just done? He has just broken the causal relationship between saving and interest rate, and investment and interest rate, from there the animal spirit. In this way, saving and investment What they're going to do is determine the level of income, and determine the level of income. The demand for work is determined, and determine the demand for work. Given an offer of work, what you're going to determine is the level of salary. If I am going to go forward, and from there you will be able to determine the prices, breaking with all the previous tradition. That is, you will have seen, when you studied Menger, which later Weiss gives the name to what he calls the imputation principle. That is, the prices determine the costs, and not the other way around. Look at what Keynes says. He says the particular level of prices in a specific individual branch depends partly on the rate of remuneration of the productive factors that enter the marginal cost, and partly on the scale of production. There is no reason to modify this conclusion when we move to the whole industry. On a general level of prices, it depends partly on the rate of remuneration of the productive factors that enter at their marginal cost, and partly on a scale of production as a whole, that is, the volume of occupation. Notice that now the prices are going to be determined as, with the famous markup on the costs. Notice that before the inflation, whose fault was it? The fault of inflation was government's. Why? Because inflation had to do with the loss of money's purchasing power, and the money's purchasing power falls to the extent that the central bank prints more than what is demanded. In other words, whose fault was it? The fault of the government itself and the central bank. Now under Keynes, the fault of inflation is the fault of the workers and the entrepreneurs. Do you realize? It takes away the blame of the politicians and transfers it to the workers and the entrepreneurs. Hence, when they want to lower the inflation, what did they do? They stigmatized the unionists, they stigmatized the entrepreneurs, and they persecuted them. For what? To shift the blame that belongs to them. Hence, inflation is a multi-causal phenomenon. All this crap is advantageous for the politicians. So look at how the analysis is going backwards. Now, in the goods market, the income is determined. The income determines the labor demand. That, with the labor supply, determines the nominal wage, and with a markup on the costs, determines the prices. The question is, what about the interest rate? Well, the interest rate is determined by the monetary market. I say that these are the ones that I just mentioned. If you pay attention, look at the last part. It says that the preference for liquidity is a potential or functional tendency that sets the amount of money that the public will save when the interest rate is known in such a way that if R is the interest rate, M is the amount of money, and L is the preference for liquidity, we see that the money supply is the same as the money demand that the interest rate depends on. In other words, it goes from determining the interest rate in the money market is something like determining the price of bananas in the car market. What is the difference? Now, that difference is like many central banks make monetary policy, because what do central banks generally control? The interest rate. Where does that come from? From the Keynesianism. That's why when they say in Argentina that the central bank is a monetarist, no, it's not a monetarist, because it controls the interest rate. If it controls the interest rate, Mr. Milton Friedman would be out of his mind, because, let's say, he talked about controlling the monetary aggregate, not about controlling prices, which is worse because it's controlling the interest rate. To know that, we need to know the marginal utility of the present assets for all assets, the marginal utility of all future assets, that conscience, to map it with the interest rate, that should also be equal to the marginal productivity of the network of depreciation with a world of heterogeneous capital. I think that not even Copperfield can know that data. I mean, how is he going to be the central bank to determine it correctly? I think that sometimes Isai got up from his grave and wrote the fatal conceit again. When he looked at some politicians, he would basically write several volumes of it. I mean, for example, in Argentina we have a adult on tape called Levi Giotti. I mean, he loves intervention. I mean, he's planning Argentina for the next 30 years. I mean, he tells us what we're going to eat, what to produce, what we have to study, what time we have to get up. I think that if he knows it, the fatal conceit is 30 volumes. Notice that Keynes has just destroyed the whole system, and the saving is not a virtue. The virtue is spending. The virtue is waste. When inflation appears, it's not the politician's fault. It's the fault of workers and businessmen. I mean, what else does a politician want? He spends like crazy, and if he has a problem, it's someone else's fault. But it's fabulous. And then there's never the late night when he says, in reality, Keynes was a particular case for a special situation. I mean, and why did he create the general theory? Right? I mean, if it was a particular case, and he says it is. He says it in chapter 1, and he says it in chapter 23. But there are authors who try to be a little more sophisticated. They tolerate Keynes. It's the sleaze. And they say, Keynes wanted to say is that this was a correction for the business cycle. So let's see what Keynes said about the business cycle. He says the remedy for the boom is not a high rate of interest, but a lower one. Let's see if they listen. The economy is in the boom, and what he says is that it is not necessary to raise it, but it must be lowered more. He says, because this can make the so-called boom last. The correct remedy for the cycle cannot be avoided by avoiding the boom and keeping us like this in permanent semi-depressions, but by avoiding depression and keeping us in this way in a quasi-boom. It was always give gas exactly what a politician wants. It is spend, 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 lower the rate, give a thread. I'm going to show you that a problem will be the fault of businessmen and workers. I don't know if you realize it, but it's a delirium. I mean, I don't know if this man consumed acid or stroke. Because it really is a total delirium. I mean, and there's more. It also talks about growth. How did growth work prior to Keynes? He saved. That savings finances the investment. That investment increases the capital stock per capita, and the product per capita increases. Think about the case of Robinson Crusoe on the island. Robinson Crusoe on the island, if he wants to consume, the first thing he has to do is what? He has to grab, he has to climb the palm tree and lower the coconuts. Because if not, it does not eat, right? I mean, can Robinson Crusoe consume something if he doesn't lower the coconuts of the palm trees? No. And if he wanted to do something else, what does he have to do? He has to save some coconuts. What for? To make a ladder. And while he saves those coconuts and makes a ladder, that allows him later, with a ladder that could also go wrong, to lower more coconuts. And if it goes well, then more coconuts are going to be lowered. Then he will be able to save, yes. Then later he will be able to make a network. Then he will be able to diversify his consumption, and he will be able to consume fish. Then he will be able to make a pot, and then everything he wants. But the basis is work and savings. No, not for Keynes. Let's see what Keynes says. In this way, our reasoning leads to the conclusion that In contemporary conditions, the growth of wealth, far from depending on the abstinence of the rich, as is generally seen, has more probability of finding an impediment. It has eliminated one of the main social justifications for the great inequality of wealth. Well, and he talks about the Lorentz tax and the redistribution of income. Why? Because what he says is that consumption generates growth. In fact, we in Argentina had a lady who was president and said, no, because when you increase consumption, that consumption generates an increase in income. That increase in income which increase investment. And that again generates an increase in consumption. A delirium. Of course, a doctor in economics at the University of Buenos Aires, called Axel Kicillof, a Keynesian, he uses delirious. In fact, when he became delirious, a new government arrived in Argentina that was supposed to change. And when they have to choose the Minister of Economy, let's say, in reality, it changed the structure and everything. In the face of the huge tax deficit that existed, where did he say it? To the one who ended up being a minister. Who was a minister because of this? He said, no, 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 no. With the tax deficit, it's not your problem. No, no, you don't have to adjust. No, because that's recessive. In reality, what you have to do is ramp up public spending, because that's going to make the gross domestic product rise so much that it's going to generate an increase in income so large that the tax deficit is going to fall. You know what's happening to the tax deficit in Argentina, right? It's growing. Well, and then you can laugh for a while about the generality and that thing. So that's the aberration that Keynes generated. Now the virtue is consumption. And if something goes wrong, it's the fault of businessmen and workers. It's a beauty. Basically, Friedman makes a resolution to destroy each and every one of Keynes' assertions. Friedman's work is a mirror of Keynes' work. I mean, and in the middle, Keynesians are put obviously. Why? Because the Keynesians are the worst of Keynes' versions. They accepted all the extreme hypotheses. Keynes was complicated, but not stupid. That's the point. So, the first important contribution of Friedman is an essay on positive economy that has to do with the nature of neoclassical economics, because what best portrays it is a phrase by Albert Arminal Keyne that says, everything is optimal, because otherwise it would be different. That is, seeing the data and understanding that it arises from people who are doing the best they can. The problem then comes, if this corresponds to the neoclassical construction or the Austrian construction. Why? Because if it is the neoclassical construction, it is the best thing that can be chosen, depending on what exists. It's like they know the whole set. On the other hand, in the Austrian version, it is a matter linked to a process of discovery. So, I mean, it would come to be the best thing you can do, but without knowing all the possibilities. So you do the best you can, depending on what you believe, what you know, and so on. And in the middle, you learn things. In other words, you can make mistakes. So the definition of optimal becomes something quite strange. But why does it work with this? Because Friedman was a disciple of Homer Jones, who had been his professor of econometrics, and he was a fan of data. So he was first of all interested in data. Well, the only thing he cared about was data. His students from different countries of the world came to him, and he asked questions about his country's data. And you know what he asked first? Where did he get that from? And that's how he started. Imagine later. So why? Because a large part of the money goes to the Keynesians. Where does it come from? It comes from using data. First of all, data. If you want to chip up the Keynesians anywhere, first of all, data. Let's say, first of all, data. The second contribution of Friedman is the theory of permanent income, which is a function of consumption. In that function of consumption, what you do depends on the present value of your income. That's where permanent income comes from. So when you have a jump in permanent income, your consumption goes in line with the jump in permanent income. However, when the increase is transitory, you practically save it all because permanent income varies little. Notice that the idea of marginal income in one case tends to 1, and in the other it tends to 0. What does this mean? That it broke that function of consumption in a single period. It broke the idea of marginal income to be consumed. It just destroyed the Keynesian multiplier. That's why, in the foundations of Friedman's book, the most important thing is the function of consumption. Then the other thing you have is that in the 50s, the inflation rate starts to increase. He can capture that in a book that Friedman called The Monetary Framework by Milton Friedman, a debate with his critics. What it ends up showing is that the demand for money is stable. If the demand for money is stable, when you increase the amount of money, the economy is in full employment. Basically, it results in an increase in prices. That's where the monetary nature of inflation comes from. And basically, what Friedman was doing was showing the relationship between the variation of prices with respect to the variation of the amount of net money and economic growth. Then the other phenomenal blow that Friedman gives to Keynesians in his book he writes with Anna Schwartz, which is entitled The Monetary History of the United States, in Chapter 7, which is called The Great Conjunction of 1928 and the 1933. And there he basically says, what are the postulates of the Keynesians? Stability of prices, prices collapsed. Stability of wages, the wages collapsed. Could the investment not respond to the interest rate? Okay, what he says is, look, when you have the real interest rate, what is it? The nominal interest rate minus the inflation. Now, if you had inflation, the real interest rate was in the clouds. And then, another thing that he rescues is, that's strictly the Great Depression, far from being a situation in which monetary policy was not effective, ends up showing that all the mistakes made by the Federal Reserve are what amplified the crisis, and that far from documenting that monetary policy was not effective, but that it was quite the opposite, because the crisis was amplified, if you want, by the poor performance of the Federal Reserve. I always recommend that you read, in parallel, the work on The Great Depression by Rothbard. That goes to the foundations of why the crisis of the 1929 occurs, and shows what is the official history according to neoclassical economics, which is the Chapter 7 of Friedman and Schwartz, in the monetary history of the United States, which are the mistakes of economic policy that amplified the crisis. And another very important issue is the role of the types of changes, because one of the things it shows is that those countries that had flexible types of change emitted, devalued, and did not have problems, like those that had fixed types of change. Once, this whole attack of Friedman was accommodated by the Keynesians, and where Friedman said, well, your problem is that you do not have an equation of prices. A work appears in 1950 by Phillips that shows a relationship between the rate of variation of nominal salaries and unemployment. Leipzig in the 60s, from the chapter 21 of the general theory that says that prices are a markup and the weight costs ends up deriving a relationship then now between variation of prices against unemployment, and there appears that negative relationship between inflation and unemployment that is studied in the traditional courses of macroeconomics. But it is not the curve that Phillips originally presented, but it is the conversion that Leipzig does, and that in that same year Samuelson and Solo tested and published in the American Economic Review and made this calculation of the rate of sacrifice, how much inflation one has to endure to basically have less unemployment. And in the 1968, this is destroyed by Milton Friedman with the hypothesis also Phillips curve increased by inflation. Basically, what Friedman said is good. If the agents have adaptive expectations, in reality you screw up the monetary emission, then the prices start to rise. Then what do businessmen see? That their prices are rising. Then they believe that real salaries are going down. Then they go out to hire workers to increase production. And when they want to hire those workers, the workers see that they're being screwed. And as they have to go from one job to the other, what do they ask? Higher salaries, because they have noticed that the salaries are going up and not the prices, because the prices come with adaptive expectations, that is, looking to the future. Then the agents make transactions at false prices, and transitorily the unemployment rate falls. Now, when all the agents realize that the central bank cheated them, they correct the new rate of monetary emission, and therefore the new inflation. Then you remain with the same level of unemployment, with a higher inflation, with which the long-term trade-off disappears. There is a short-term trade-off, and there is no long-term trade-off. And what does Lucas do? What Lucas does is develop a model of rational expectations, and he says you can't be cheating people all the time. People are going to learn. Then he says when the agents know the monetary rule, if the central bank modifies the monetary rule by enhancing it, what is going to happen? The unemployment rate will not fall. It will directly go to a higher inflation level. And if the central bank cheats the agents, that is in rational expectations, there is a trade-off. When the central bank cheats the agents, it announces a monetary rule and does something else. So if it emits more than it announced, transitorily, what happens? There is a trade-off. However, when the agents learn what happens, automatically they return to the level of full employment. And if the central bank tries to use the trick recurrently, while the hypothesis of the securitizationist comes out, you could maintain the unemployment rate below the natural rate. What Lucas' model says is, no, that is unfeasible, because the more risk they give, the agents are going to associate those new emission waves with new attempts by the central bank, and therefore every time it will yield less. And what happens there? The micro fundamentals end up recovering. Once the micro fundamentals and the intertemporality end up recovering, what was the step? It was to return to the research program of Adam Smith, the formal origin of our science. That is, the research on nature and the causes of national wealth, that is, economic growth. And that is when Lucas begins to re-examine the theory of growth that in 1985-1986, with Roma and Lucas derives from the modern theory of endogenous growth. In short, those who won the debate since the intertemporality and the micro fundamentals in the background have been the Austrians.
Eso es todo. Muchas gracias.
That's all. Thank you very much.